The cattle were screaming. That was the only word for it, that high, terrible pitch cutting through the black throat of the Montana night. 300 head of Hereford beef pressing against each other in blind panic as the fever moved through them like wildfire through dry grass. Ralph Bishop stood at the edge of the holding pen with his hat in both fists, knuckles white, jaw clamped so tight his back teeth ached. He had not slept in 36 hours. He had ridden to every corner of his land and back again. He had lost 11 animals already, their bodies dragged to the far pasture by his 2 remaining ranch hands, and he was watching his entire future, 4 years of work, 4 years of sacrifice, every cent his father had left him, and every drop of blood he himself had poured into this earth, curling at the edges like burning paper. And she was standing not 20 feet away. Louisa Keene, 26 years old, daughter of the late Dr. Louisa Keene, trained in veterinary medicine by her father from the time she could read, self-taught in the rest, holder of knowledge that no school in this territory had been willing to formally grant to a woman. She was standing at the fence rail with her arms folded across her chest, watching him with those dark, steady eyes that always seemed to be measuring something he could not see. Her medical bag, the battered leather satchel she carried everywhere, was sitting at her feet in the mud. She had come to him 3 hours ago. She had knocked on his door in the rain and told him, calm as still water, that she had seen the signs from the road, that she knew what was killing his cattle, that she had the means to treat it. He had thanked her politely and told her he had it handled. He did not have it handled, and she was still there. She had not left. She had simply walked to the fence and waited, and in the time that Ralph Bishop stood inside the pen trying to remember everything he thought he knew and watching 2 more animals go down, she had already opened her bag, already mixed something by lantern light, already filled a series of syringes from the vials she carried with a steadiness that made the act look like prayer. "Bishop," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut clean through the noise. He turned to look at her. She held up one of the syringes. "I am going to start on the southeast cluster. They are the earliest symptomatic, and I need to work outward from the center of infection. I will need you to restrain them. You can either help me or you can stand there protecting your pride while the rest of your herd dies. I genuinely do not care which you choose, but I want you to be clear that you are choosing." Something cracked open behind his sternum. It was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the specific, shattering humiliation of knowing she was right. He put his hat back on his head. He opened the gate. And Ralph Bishop, who had never in his 30 years on this earth asked anyone for a single thing he thought he should be able to manage himself, said nothing at all, and went to hold the first animal steady. That was the night everything between them changed. But the story of how they arrived at that gate, and everything that came after, began 6 weeks earlier on the hottest afternoon of that Montana summer, in the dusty main street of a town called Harlan's Crossing. The summer of 1882 had come to Harlan's Crossing like a debt collector, relentless, humorless, and impossible to reason with. The town itself was modest by any measure. A general store, a bank, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a church whose bell had been cracked since 1879, and a scattering of modest wooden structures along a street that turned to mud in rain and cracked red clay in heat. The surrounding territory was cattle country, high plains rolling toward the Rockies, and the men who worked it were the kind of men who measured themselves by the land they held and the animals they kept. Ralph Bishop had ridden into town that Tuesday to pick up a feed order and had ended up staying longer than intended because his horse threw a shoe 2 blocks from the livery, and Hank Morrow, who ran the livery, was backed up until afternoon. Ralph sat on the porch of the general store with a cup of coffee he did not particularly want, watching the street with the unhurried attention of a man who had nowhere comfortable to be. He was a striking figure even sitting still. 6'2", broad through the shoulder, with the kind of lean, coiled strength that comes from years of physical work rather than deliberate cultivation. His face was angular, sun-darkened, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into too many horizons. He was not a man who spoke unnecessarily. He had opinions, strong ones, but he had long ago discovered that most conversations were just noise and very few of them changed anything. So he kept his counsel and let the world move around him. He was watching the street when the commotion started outside the veterinarian's office. Dr. Louisa Keene had been Harlan's Crossing's only animal doctor for 17 years. He had died 8 months ago of pneumonia, and his practice had theoretically closed with him, except that it had not quite, because his daughter had kept the door open and kept seeing animals and kept charging a modest fee, and nobody had quite gotten around to making it official that this was not acceptable because the animals kept getting better and nobody could find anyone else to do it. The commotion was Gerald Hatch. Gerald Hatch owned the largest ranch in the county, a man who wore his wealth like a weapon, and he was standing in the street outside Keene's office with his face the color of a boiled beet, holding the reins of a horse that was visibly favoring its left foreleg. "I asked for a doctor," Hatch was saying, loud enough that Ralph could hear every word from the porch. "Not a girl playing doctor." Louisa Keene came to the door of the office and stood there with a composure that Ralph found immediately arresting. She was not particularly tall, but she held herself in a way that suggested she was precisely as tall as she needed to be. She wore a plain work dress and an apron, her dark hair pinned back practically, and she was wiping her hands on a cloth with the unhurried ease of someone who had heard this argument before and found it tedious. "Mr. Hatch," she said, "your horse has a hairline fracture in the lateral condyle of the left fetlock." She compensated for it by shifting weight to her right foreleg, which has now developed secondary inflammation in the suspensory ligament. "If you put her back to work before both are treated, she will go permanently lame within a month. I am prepared to treat both issues today. You may, alternatively, ride to Billings and find a male veterinarian who will tell you exactly the same thing, but that is 3 days each way, and your horse will be in worse condition by the time you return." Hatch stared at her. The street was quiet. A few people had stopped to watch. "How much?" he said finally. $2 for the initial treatment, another $1 when I follow up next week." There was a pause that felt like watching a man try to find a door in a wall he had always assumed was solid. Then Hatch handed her the reins and said nothing more, and Louisa Keene led the horse inside with the calm certainty of someone who had already known how it would end. Ralph did not realize he had stood up from his chair until he was already standing. He sat back down. He finished his cold coffee. He told himself it was not his business. But he watched the door of that office for another 20 minutes, and when he went to collect his horse from the livery, he found himself walking past the front of the Keene practice slowly enough to hear, from inside, the steady murmur of her voice explaining something to the animal in a tone that was simultaneously professional and genuinely kind. He could not make out the words. He did not need to. He rode home thinking about those dark, measuring eyes. The Bishop Ranch was called the Double Cross, not for any dramatic reason, but because Ralph's father Daniel Bishop had marked his cattle with a Double Cross brand and the name had stuck. It sat on 420 acres of good grass with a creek running through the eastern quarter, and a view of the mountains on clear mornings that Ralph privately thought was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, though he would not have said so to anyone. He had inherited it at 25 when his father died of a stroke, and he had spent the 5 years since then building it into something that could actually sustain a future. The herd was his pride. 317 Hereford cattle, healthy and well-managed, worth a figure that would have made his father proud. He had a system, a routine, a method for every problem the ranch threw at him, and he prided himself on solving those problems himself. He did not like asking for help. He was not sure he knew how. His father had been the same way, a quality that Ralph had inherited without ever questioning whether it was actually a virtue. He hired 2 hands in the spring clem tours, a quiet Mexican cowboy who was better with horses than anyone Ralph had ever seen, and Dix Albright, a former army man who was reliable if occasionally moody. They were good workers. They did not ask questions he did not want to answer. The arrangement suited everyone. The first week of August arrived with a heat that pressed down on the land like a flat iron, and Ralph was checking the eastern fence line when he found the first sick animal. A young bull, 3 years old, standing apart from the herd with his head low and his breathing shallow. Ralph rode around him twice, examining him from horseback, then dismounted and checked him more closely. The animal's temperature was elevated, his mucous membranes slightly pale, and there was a distinctive discharge from his nose that Ralph did not recognize. He treated it as he knew how isolated the animal, gave him fresh water, watched him overnight. In the morning the bull was worse, and by afternoon he had found 3 more showing early symptoms. Ralph sent Clem to town for Louisa Keene before remembering that Louisa Keene was 8 months dead. Clem came back saying the only person available was the daughter. "She knows what she is doing," Clem said carefully. He had seen her work on his own horses. "Better than she lets on." "I know what I'm doing too," Ralph said. "Send to Billings for their veterinarian." The Billings veterinarian was available in 5 days. By day 3, Ralph had lost 4 animals. He spent those 3 days fighting the disease with everything he knew and everything he could look up in the agricultural almanac he kept on his shelf, and everything he could recall from his father's advice and his own experience. He changed his approach twice. He consulted with Dix, who had some experience with cattle illness from his army days at a frontier post. He wrote a letter to an agricultural extension he had read about in a newspaper and knew immediately that even if the response came, it would not come in time. Day 4, a Saturday, and he had lost 7 total, with another 12 showing clear symptoms, and perhaps 30 more in early stages. He was at the edge of his capacity, not physical capacity. He could work indefinitely. He had done it before, but intellectual capacity. He was throwing remedies at a problem he did not fully understand, and the problem was not responding. It was Clem who said it. He said it quietly while they were working, the way Clem said everything important. "She came by this morning, Miss Keene. She said she had seen the herd from the road on her rounds and she thought she knew what it was." Ralph did not respond. "She left her card," Clem added, holding it out. Ralph looked at the card. Louisa Keene, Veterinary Medicine, Harlan's Crossing. He had been in town 4 more times since that Tuesday and had not gone into her office. He had thought about those eyes more than he was comfortable admitting, and thinking about them made him careful to keep his distance, which made him feel foolish, which made him keep his distance more firmly. It was not a cycle that reflected well on him. "Thank you, Clem," he said, and put the card in his shirt pocket. He did not send for her. By Friday of the following week she came to him. He was in the barn when he heard the buckboard coming up the drive, and he came out to find her already climbing down before the vehicle had fully stopped, her medical bag in hand, moving toward the holding pen with the purposeful stride of someone who has already assessed the situation from a distance and decided what needs to be done. "Miss Keene," he said. She stopped, turned. She looked at him with those steady eyes, and there was a beat of silence between them that felt weighted. "Mr. Bishop, I am going to look at your herd. You are welcome to accompany me." It was not phrased as a request. He accompanied her. He watched her move through the herd, with a confidence and a gentleness he found immediately disarming, checking animals systematically, her hands moving with practiced certainty over flanks and faces and legs, her lips moving quietly as she counted and categorized what she was seeing. She spent 12 minutes in the pen before she came back to the fence where he was standing. "Bovine pleuropneumonia," she said. "Contagious. It entered your herd through the 3 animals you purchased from the Morrison sale in June. The incubation period can be 3 to 4 weeks, which is why you are only seeing widespread symptoms now. You lost 12. 11, he said. He felt the number like a stone in his chest. "I have seen this before. My father treated an outbreak near Miles City in 1876. He documented his treatment extensively, and I have his notes. The infection responds to a specific treatment protocol. I have the materials. I have done this before on a smaller scale, and with your full herd size, we need to begin immediately." She paused. "Do you want my help?" The word help sat in the air between them. Ralph Bishop looked at this woman, at the certainty in her posture, the knowledge in her eyes, the complete and utter lack of any need for his approval or his validation, and felt something he did not have a clean name for. It was not condescension from her. She was not looking at him with pity or superiority. She was looking at him the way a surgeon looks at a situation, clearly, directly, already several steps ahead of where he was standing. "I have the Billings veterinarian coming Monday," he said. "That is 4 days from now. If you lose animals at the current rate, you will have lost another 20 before he arrives." She said it without accusation, just fact. "But that is your choice to make, Mr. Bishop." She picked up her bag, turned toward her buckboard. "Miss Keene." She stopped but did not turn. He could feel the word lodge somewhere in his throat like a splinter. "If you have the time, I would be grateful for your assessment." She did turn then, and something in her expression shifted, so briefly that he might have imagined it something that was not quite a smile, but was not nothing either. "I have the time," she said. That first afternoon she worked for 5 hours straight. Ralph stayed with her the entire time, watching, learning, asking questions that surprised him with how naturally they came once he had crossed the initial barrier of asking the first one. She answered everything without condescension, explaining as she worked, her hands never stilling, her thinking always a step ahead of where they were. She had a method that was systematic in a way he recognized and respected, the kind of thinking that comes not from rote memorization, but from genuine understanding, from having sat with her father through enough cases that the underlying principles had become second nature. She treated the most severely affected animals first, working outward in rings as she had described, documenting each animal's condition in a small notebook she kept in her bag. "Your father taught you all of this?" he asked at one point, not skeptically, just with genuine curiosity. "My father taught me most of it," she said, not looking up from what she was doing. "The rest I read. There is a great deal published if you know where to look. And the rest I learned by doing, which is the only way to really learn anything." She glanced up at him briefly. "He wanted me to go east to study formally. There were a few places beginning to accept women in the 1870s, but he took ill and I stayed." There was something in how she said it that told him she did not want sympathy for that, so he did not offer any. "You plan to stay in Harlan's Crossing?" he asked instead. She was quiet for a moment. "I plan to stay as long as I am needed, and I am needed here." A brief pause. "Does that answer your question?" "Not entirely," he said. She looked at him then with a new quality in her gaze, something that was assessing him differently than she had been before, and then went back to work. She came back the following morning before he had finished breakfast. He heard her buckboard on the drive and came out still holding his coffee cup, and she was already in the holding pen checking on the animals from the night before, and something about the sight of her there, in the early morning light with the mountains clear behind her, settled into him like the answer to a question he had not known he was asking. She caught him looking. He looked away. Neither of them said anything about it. She worked mornings and he worked alongside her, learning the treatment protocol well enough that he could handle the less complicated cases himself, freeing her to focus on the most critical animals. He made her coffee. He built a small shade structure near the pen so she did not work in full afternoon sun. He did not make a production of either of these things, and she accepted them without fuss, which somehow made it more meaningful than if either of them had commented on it. On the third day he asked about her mother. "She died when I was 4, Louisa said. "Fever. My father raised me alone after that. He did not see any reason why I should not learn everything he knew." He sounds like a good man. He was. He was also stubborn and occasionally infuriating, and he never once admitted he was wrong about anything, which is a quality I have apparently inherited. She said it without self-pity, with a light irony that Ralph found unexpectedly charming. I wouldn't know anything about that, he said. She turned and looked at him fully, and then she laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a social laugh. It was a real one, sudden and unguarded, and it was the most disarming thing he had ever heard. His chest did something complicated. On the fourth day, Monday, the Billings veterinarian arrived. His name was Dr. Forsyth, a large, competent man in his 40s who had been practicing for 20 years. He walked the herd with Ralph, examined the treatment notes Louisa had left, talked to Clem and Dix about what had been done, and then came to find Ralph at the barn. "Whoever is treating these animals knows exactly what they are doing," Forsyth said. "The protocol is correct, the documentation is excellent, and the progression I am seeing is consistent with a controlled outbreak. If this continues the way it is going, you should not lose any more animals." He looked around. "Who is doing the work?" "Miss Keene," Ralph said. "Louisa Keene. Her father was the local veterinarian." Forsyth was quiet a moment. "Elias Keene's daughter. I knew Elias, fine practitioner." He paused. "If she is doing work at this level, she is more than competent. She is exceptional." He gave Ralph a direct look. "You are a fortunate man, Mr. Bishop." Ralph looked out at the holding pen where Louisa was currently working on one of the more critical cases, moving with that fluid certainty he had been watching for 4 days. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know." That evening, after Louisa had packed her bag and was preparing to drive back to town, Ralph caught her at the buckboard. "Dr. Forsyth says you are exceptional," he said. She was straightening her bag and did not immediately look up. "Doctor Forsyth is a kind man. He is a practical man. He doesn't give compliments for the sake of it." Ralph paused. "Neither do I." She looked up then. The late sun caught her face and he had to work to keep his expression from showing everything he was feeling. "Thank you, Mr. Bishop," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. "Ralph," he said, "a beat." "Louisa," she replied. He helped her up into the buckboard, which was the first time he had touched her, just his hand at her elbow, steady and brief. And even that small contact left an impression on him that lasted the entire evening. The night that everything truly cracked open was the one he had lived through before the flashback began, the night of the mass outbreak, the night she came to him in the rain. It was not the beginning, but it was the turning point, the night when all the careful distance he had been maintaining and all the careful pride he had been protecting finally met the reality of what was at stake. The outbreak had worsened suddenly on a Thursday. The treatment appeared to be working on the animals they had already addressed, but a secondary cluster had developed in the West Pasture, a group of 30 cattle that had been less closely monitored, and the disease had progressed further in them than Ralph had realized. He discovered it that evening when Dix came to him with his face stripped of its usual settled expression. By midnight, Ralph was in the pasture alone, working by lantern light, losing the thread of what to do next. He knew the treatment protocol, but he knew it the way a student knows a text. He could follow it. But when the situation deviated from the expected, when an animal responded differently, when variables shifted, he was at the edge of his knowledge, squinting at the far side of it and not sure what he was seeing. He thought of sending Clem for Louisa. He told himself he had this. He tried 2 things that did not work. He tried a third thing. He lost another 2 animals, and the sound they made and the weight of their deaths pressed down on him in the dark until his chest felt hollow. He was standing at the fence, hat in his hands, when he heard hoofbeats. She had come on horseback, not the buckboard. She was in her work clothes with her medical bag across her back and her hair loose because she had not stopped to pin it, and when she swung down from the saddle it was without the polish of a woman who has prepared to be seen. It was just movement, fast, practical, purposeful. "I could see the lanterns from the road," she said. "How many?" 2 more tonight. 30 animals in the West Cluster showing symptoms." She was already opening her bag, already assessing, already 3 steps into a plan. "I need to talk you through the secondary protocol," she said. "Your instinct to isolate was correct, but the treatment for advanced cases differs from what we have been doing. There is a dosing adjustment and the sequence matters." "You could have told me that earlier," he said, and immediately heard how it sounded. She looked at him steadily. There was no anger in it, but there was a clearness that was almost worse. I sent you notes on the secondary protocol on Wednesday. Clem delivered them with your supply order. He had not read them thoroughly. He had skimmed them and told himself he had the general shape of it and that would be enough. It had not been enough. The humiliation of that, the specific, particular humiliation of a man who had dismissed expertise he needed because asking for help felt like weakness, settled into him in a way that was genuinely uncomfortable and genuinely deserved. "I'm sorry," he said. He had not said those words in longer than he could remember. Her expression shifted, not to triumph, to something more like understanding, and that was somehow harder to receive. "Restrain the first animal," she said. "I will walk you through everything." They worked through the night together. Ralph learned more about bovine pleuropneumonia in those 6 hours than in the entire preceding week, not because she lectured, but because she explained as she worked, answering his questions with the patience of someone who genuinely loves what they know and genuinely wants to transmit it. She did not make him feel foolish for not knowing. She made him feel that the knowing was possible, achievable within reach, that the gap between where he was and where she was could be crossed with attention and willingness rather than years of training. Around 3 in the morning they sat on the fence rail with 2 cups of coffee that Ralph had brought from the house, and the work was done for the night, and the herd was quieter, and the Montana sky was enormous above them, thick with stars. "You should have called for me earlier," she said, not as an accusation, as something she needed to say. "I know that now," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was complicated, and he was not, by nature, a man who explained himself readily. But it was 3 in the morning, and they had just spent 6 hours in genuine crisis together, and the usual armor felt both unnecessary and slightly absurd. "My father was the kind of man who handled things himself," he said. It was not he did not say outright that asking for help was weakness. He didn't need to. It was just clear that the men he respected were the ones who managed on their own. He paused. "I have carried that for a long time without thinking much about it." Louisa was quiet. Then, "My father was similar in some ways, stubborn about his own methods, but he also used to say that the animal that refuses help when it needs help is the animal that dies. And he said it about people too." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "He learned it the hard way, and I have tried not to." "You are better at it than I am," Ralph said, "at accepting help. At most things," he said, and meant it simply, without self-deprecation or flattery, just as the observation it was. She looked at him, and in the starlight the expression on her face was unguarded in a way he had not seen before. It made her look younger and older at the same time. "Ralph," she said. "Yes, I need to ask you something directly." His pulse did something that he chose not to examine. "All right," he said. "Over the past 2 weeks you have been kind, considerate. You learn quickly and you take what I say seriously, which is not as common as it should be." She paused. "I need to know if that is because you are a good man in general, or if there is something specific about how you feel about me that I should know about, because I have found that being clear about these things is more efficient than not being clear." He almost smiled at that. The most direct question he had ever been asked, delivered in the most practical possible framing. "Both," he said. A pause. "Both. I am trying to be a good man in general, and I have feelings that are specific to you, that have been growing since the first time I saw you in that street with Hatch and his horse, and have been getting harder to ignore every day since." He looked at her directly. "I am not a man who says things I do not mean." "I know that," she said. "I have been watching." And she was quiet for a long moment. The cattle shifted in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called and was answered. "And I am not the kind of woman who makes herself small to fit a life that was not made for her," she said carefully. "I have watched women do that my entire life, and I will not do it. My work matters to me. My independence matters to me. If a man cannot respect that, genuinely respect it, not just tolerate it, then there is no point." "I have not asked you to be anything other than what you are," Ralph said. "No," she said. You haven't. Another pause. That is somewhat unprecedented in my experience. Then other men have been fools, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look steadily. He did not look away, and he did not fill the silence with anything more, because he had said what was true, and what was true was enough. "All right," she said finally. A small, careful thing, but he heard everything in it. He did not reach for her hand that night. It felt too soon for that, too abrupt after what had been said. But when she climbed back on her horse as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, he stood at the fence and watched her go, and something in him that had been wound tight for years was a notch looser. The following week brought the aftermath of the outbreak, which was its own kind of work, monitoring recovering animals, documenting the losses for insurance purposes, sourcing replacement stock to consider for the spring. Louisa came every other day, then every third day as the immediate crisis passed and the herd stabilized. The last of the critically ill animals either recovered or did not, and the final count of losses was 17, which was significant and painful but was not, as it might have been, catastrophic. Gerald Hatch stopped Ralph in town one afternoon and told him he had heard about the outbreak and the Bishop Ranch's losses, with a kind of barely concealed satisfaction that Ralph found repugnant. He also told Ralph, with the expansive generosity of a man who has no real intention of being generous, that if Ralph found himself needing cash to stay afloat through the winter, Hatch might be interested in buying some of the eastern acreage. Ralph looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "Thank you, Gerald," he said then with great politeness. "I will remember that." And he walked away, which left Hatch standing in the street with his mouth slightly open, because what Ralph did not say, but what was very clear, was that he would sooner sell the boots off his feet. He went directly from that conversation to Louisa's office, because he was going there anyway. He had told himself it was to discuss the remaining treatment schedule, and she was in the middle of seeing a patient, which in this case was a sheepdog belonging to a homesteader family from the South Valley. Ralph sat on the bench outside the office and waited, and he could hear her voice through the door, that same calm, steady murmur he had first noticed in the street, and he found that just hearing it settled something in him. When the family emerged, the sheepdog walking better than it had arrived, the homesteader's wife stopped at the sight of Ralph and told him that she didn't know what she would have done without Miss Keene, because the dog kept the sheep safe from coyotes, and without the dog they'd have lost half the flock by now. She said it with a feeling that Ralph understood, because it was the same feeling he had, that specific gratitude you feel for someone who has stepped into a crisis with competence and care and made the difference between loss and survival. When the family had gone, Louisa appeared in the doorway and looked at him with slightly raised eyebrows. "Did you come for a specific reason," she said, "or are you just sitting on my bench?" "Both," he said. She almost smiled. "You use that answer a great deal." "It tends to be accurate." He stood. "I came to tell you that Gerald Hatch tried to offer me money for the eastern acreage today." "What did you say?" "I said I would remember the offer." "Meaning no?" "Meaning absolutely not." He paused. "But it reminded me that the losses are significant and the recovery will take longer than I had planned, which means the ranch will be tighter this winter than last." He said it straightforwardly, without shame. He was finding it progressively easier to say difficult things to her, a development he was still adjusting to. "I wanted you to know that, given the direction of things between us, it is only fair." She looked at him with that measuring quality that had unnerved him the first time he saw it, and now just felt like being truly seen. "Ralph," she said, "I did not grow up with money. My father traded his services for eggs and labor half the time because the families around here could not afford to pay him cash. The ranch being tight this winter is not information that changes anything about how I feel." She paused. "Although I do want you to know that I keep a careful account of my practice income, and I am not in the habit of being financially dependent on anyone." "I wouldn't expect you to be," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "We do," he said, and because they were standing close and the morning light was coming through the window and she was looking at him with those eyes that had been keeping him company in his thoughts for weeks, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture, done gently, and she went very still, but she did not move away. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. "The hotel dining room. Saturday evening if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said quietly. Saturday came with the particular softness of late summer afternoons in Montana, the heat easing toward evening, the mountains turning colors in the western light. Ralph cleaned up more carefully than he had in years, found the good shirt he had not worn since the last social gathering he had reluctantly attended, and drove his horse to town with something he recognized as nervousness, and found slightly ridiculous in a man his age. She was ready when he arrived at her office, which doubled as her residence in the small rooms behind. She wore a deep blue dress he had not seen before, and her hair was done differently, more elaborately, and she was wearing small pearl earrings that had been her mother's, he would learn later. She looked beautiful. He told her so simply, which seemed to catch her off guard in a way that made him think she was not often told. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment Harlan's Crossing offered, which was modest by any external standard but pleasant in its way. White tablecloths, candles in glasses, a menu of 4 options prepared by a cook who had learned his trade in St. Louis and had ended up in Montana by a chain of circumstances he had never fully explained. Several people looked at them with open curiosity when they came in. Louisa appeared not to notice. Ralph noticed and did not care. They talked for 3 hours. He learned things he had not known, about her years with her father, about the cases she had handled, about the 2 times she had applied to veterinary programs in the East and been turned down explicitly because she was a woman, and what that had cost her, and how she had rebuilt her sense of purpose around the work itself rather than the credential. She told it without bitterness, but the injustice of it was clear and real, and he felt it on her behalf with an anger that surprised him with its strength. "You should have been allowed," he said. "There is no sensible argument against it." "No sensible one," she agreed, "but sense rarely wins against habit." "It will," he said, "eventually." "I know," she said. "I just don't want to be 50 before it does." She asked him about the ranch, about his father, about the years after. He told her more than he had intended to about what it had been like to inherit at 25, and the particular loneliness of running a large operation that you have built yourself, because there is no one to share the small victories with, no one to talk through the problems at the end of the day. He had not articulated that before, not to himself or anyone. It came out more raw than he intended, and he saw the recognition in her face that told him she understood exactly what he meant because she had lived a version of the same thing. "Loneliness is quieter when you are busy," she said, "but it does not go away." "No," he agreed. "I have thought," she said carefully, "that the reason I did not leave after my father died, even though I could have tried the East again or gone somewhere else, is that I had built something here, small, but mine, and leaving it would have felt like losing him twice." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She looked down at his hand on hers and then looked up at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You will not have to be lonely here," he said. Something moved across her face, something that was close to relief, the specific relief of a person who has held themselves tightly together for a long time and has unexpectedly found a reason to ease. "Neither will you," she said. They were quiet on the drive back to her office. The night was warm and the stars were extraordinary, and when he stopped in front of her door and helped her down, they stood close together in the street for a moment, neither of them quite ready to end the evening. He kissed her. Gentle, unhurried, his hand light at her jaw. She kissed him back with a directness that was entirely characteristic of her, a woman who did not do anything halfway. When they broke apart, she looked at him with bright, serious eyes. "Good night, Ralph," she said. "Good night, Louisa," he said. He drove home through the Montana night with the windows of the wagon open and the warm air full of sage and grass, and he felt something he had not felt in so long he had almost forgotten its name. August moved into September with the steady, unhurried pace of seasons in that country, and the days took on a new quality. Ralph found reasons to be in town on a Wednesday when he had no formal errands, and Louisa found herself driving out past the Double Cross on her rounds more often than was strictly necessary. They were careful about it, she was careful, because she knew the way small towns talked about women, and she had no intention of giving Harlan's Crossing anything to speculate about. But the care itself was a kind of intimacy, a shared understanding of what needed to be protected. He brought her books when he went to Billings for supplies. Agricultural journals, but also other things, a novel she had mentioned once in passing, a collection of essays on natural science that he had spotted in a shop window and thought she would like. She kept them in a growing stack on her desk, and he noticed, when he visited, that all of them showed signs of having been read closely. She taught him, over a series of evenings when he stayed past supper, more about the veterinary practice than he had ever thought to know. Not because it was necessary for the ranch, but because she loved it and it was interesting, and he found that listening to her think through a problem, watching the quality of her attention and the elegance of her reasoning, was genuinely one of the most pleasurable things he could do with an evening. "You would have been a good scientist," she told him once. "I am a cattleman," he said. "You can be both," she said. "You think empirically, most people don't." Meaning what? Meaning when something does not work, you want to understand why, not just try something else. Most people just try something else. She looked at him over her coffee cup. It is a rare quality. He did not say that he had not always been that way, that he had in fact been exactly the kind of man who just tried something else until 2 weeks ago when she had showed him the difference. He thought she probably knew that already. In October, Gerald Hatch became a problem. Hatch had, for reasons that Ralph did not immediately understand, decided to take an interest in Louisa Keene. Not a romantic interest. Hatch was married, an arrangement that had always been more practical than emotional on both sides, but a business interest, or something presenting itself as one. He came to her office twice in 1 week, each time with a different animal from his large operation, and the second time he came he suggested, with the false ease of a man accustomed to getting what he wants, that she might want to consider working exclusively for the Hatch Ranch at a fixed salary rather than seeing all comers. It would be more stable, he said. A guaranteed income, a proper professional arrangement. Louisa looked at him. And I would see only Hatch animals. You would be well compensated. Mr. Hatch, she said, I appreciate the offer. I am not interested. My practice is to this community, not to any single employer. She said it pleasantly and finally in the tone that ended conversations. Hatch did not take it as finally as she had intended. He came back a third time with a higher number and a slightly different framing, and the third time he also mentioned, as though in passing, that it was unusual for a woman to be operating a professional practice without any formal credential or licensing, and that he imagined some people might have concerns about that, from a regulatory standpoint. Louisa heard the threat clearly. She thanked him for his time and showed him out. She told Ralph about it that evening, sitting at the table in her back rooms, and he sat across from her and listened without interrupting, his face going through a series of controlled expressions that told her he was considerably more angry than his voice was letting on. He is trying to leverage you, Ralph said. Yes. Do you want me to speak to him? She looked at him directly. No. He held her look. Because you can handle it yourself. Because I can handle it myself. And because if you speak to him it will look like I needed a man to defend me, which will make my position in this town smaller, not larger. She paused. I know you would like to. I understand that, but the answer is still no. He was quiet for a moment, then, what do you need from me? It was, she would think later, exactly the right question. I need you to be a visible, documented client, she said. Hatch is worried about the lack of formal credential. If I have a strong record of successful treatment across multiple prominent operations in this county, it becomes much harder to use that against me. You heard the Forsyth endorsement, the cases I have on record, These are my credential, even if they do not come on paper. I will write a letter, he said, attesting to your work, the outbreak treatment, the outcomes. I will send copies to the County Agricultural Board and the Territorial Legislature's Agricultural Committee, she blinked. That is more than I asked for. It is less than you deserve, he said it simply. And if Hatch says anything further about credentials or licensing, you tell me and I will consult our lawyer in Billings about what options exist. Our lawyer. I keep a lawyer on retainer for the ranch. He handles contracts, disputes, the usual. This would be within his scope. He met her eyes. Louisa, you have built something real here. I will not watch someone like Gerald Hatch dismantle it out of spite. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, which was the inverse of what he had done that evening at the hotel, and he turned his hand over to hold hers. Thank you, she said. You don't have to thank me for being on your side, he said. The letter went out the following week. It was thorough, factual, and unambiguous in its praise, and it bore Ralph's name and the Double Cross brand, which carried enough weight in that county that the Agricultural Board sent a letter back acknowledging Miss Keene's practice and expressing, somewhat formally, their appreciation for her contribution to the livestock health of the region. It was not a credential, but it was something, and it mattered. Hatch did not come back to her office. November arrived with the first real cold, the kind that came down from Canada with serious intent, and froze the water troughs overnight and sent everyone to check their firewood stores. The Double Cross was well prepared. Ralph had spent September and October with one eye always on winter, a habit so ingrained it was nearly unconscious, and Louisa's office was snug enough if she kept the stove going, which she did. One Sunday afternoon in early November, Ralph drove to her office with the specific intention of asking her something he had been organizing his courage around for approximately 3 weeks. He had the ring in his pocket. It had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that his father had purchased from a Crow trader 30 years ago, which seemed appropriate given where they lived and who they were. He had cleaned it and had it sized, as best he could estimate, by the jeweler in Billings. He knocked on her door. She answered it with ink on her fingers and a sheaf of papers in her hand, clearly in the middle of something. She took one look at his face and put the papers down on the nearest surface. "What's happened?" she asked immediately. "Nothing has happened," he said. "I need to talk to you." She stood back and let him in. The office was warm and smelled of the herbs she kept for treatments, and the coffee she apparently drank constantly, and a faint undertone of something clean and medicinal. He had grown to love that smell with an intensity that seemed disproportionate but was entirely genuine. She was watching him with those steady eyes. He was not a man who made speeches. He had thought about what to say and had concluded that the simplest version was the most honest version. "I love you," he said. "I have been sure of it for some time, and I am not a man who says things he is not sure of. I want to marry you. Not to make you smaller or to claim you or to change what you have built here, but because I want to be with you for the rest of my life and I want to build things together that we cannot build separately." He reached into his pocket. "This was my mother's ring. You do not have to take it right now. You can think about it as long as you need." Louisa looked at the ring in his open palm. Then she looked up at him. "How long ago did you decide?" she asked. "October," he said. "Although I think the decision was made earlier than that and I was just slower to acknowledge it." "That sounds like you," she said, with a warmth in it that took any edge off the words. "Louisa." "Yes," she said. "I will marry you. Not because I need you or because I am afraid of being alone, but because you are the only person I have ever met who makes my life larger by being in it. And I love you." She said the last part more quietly, as if it was something she had been protecting and was choosing now to share. "I have loved you since you said 'I'm sorry' at the fence at 3 in the morning, which is possibly the most specific reason to fall in love with someone that I have ever heard." He laughed. It came out rough and surprised, and then she laughed too, and he crossed the room and kissed her with the ring still in his hand, and she pulled back just enough to hold out her left hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit almost exactly, which felt like a sign from whatever in the universe arranged such things. They were married in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, in the church with the cracked bell that still managed to ring well enough for the occasion. It was a small ceremony. Clem Torres and his wife Maria, Dix Albright, the homesteader family whose sheepdog Louisa had treated, Dr. Forsyth, who had made the trip from Billings specifically and who shook Ralph's hand with great warmth, and it was the right size. Louisa wore her mother's pearl earrings and a cream-colored dress that Maria Torres had helped her alter, and Ralph wore his best clothes and stood at the front of that church with the mountain light coming through the windows, and watched her walk toward him with a steadiness and a certainty that was so entirely herself that he felt it press into him like something permanent. The minister asked the standard questions, received the standard answers, and pronounced them married, and Ralph kissed his wife in front of their small community of people and felt, for the first time in many years, that the future was not a solitary thing. They lived in the double cross as they had planned. Louisa kept her practice, driving to town 4 days a week, and Ralph had long since come to understand that this was not a negotiation or a compromise, but simply a fact as fundamental to who she was as his attachment to the land was to who he was. They were people who were defined by their work, and they had found, improbably and precisely, someone who understood that. She kept her office in town, but expanded her hours at the ranch, building a small treatment area in the east corner of the barn that Ralph constructed for her over 3 weekends in January. He had not been asked to build it. He had seen her struggling to treat larger animals in the yard and had started digging post holes on a Saturday morning without announcement, and when she came out of the house to see what he was doing, she had stood there for a moment with her coffee and then gone back inside and come out 10 minutes later with her coat on to help him. They did not always agree. He was, as she had observed, stubborn, and she was equally so, and there were arguments, real ones, not performed disagreements but genuine clashes of perspective that sometimes took a whole evening to work through. She challenged his assumptions about how the ranch should be run, and he challenged her tendency to take on more cases than she could comfortably handle because she found it difficult to turn people away. They were better arguments than either of them had ever had before, because they were arguments with someone who was genuinely engaging, and they always resolved before sleep. Spring came to the Double Cross with the particular violence and beauty of Montana spring snowmelt and mud, and then suddenly green, the kind of green that makes you forget the winter was ever as long as it was. The herd was healthy, rebuilt from the losses of the previous summer with careful selection of new stock, and Ralph walked the pastures in the early mornings with the feeling of a man who has come through something and arrived somewhere. In April, Louisa told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the same directness she applied to everything sitting across from him at breakfast, setting down her coffee cup and saying, "I believe I am expecting. I will confirm it more precisely in the coming week, but I wanted to tell you as soon as I was reasonably sure." He looked at her for a moment, processing. Then he came around the table and knelt beside her chair, which was not something he had planned, and took both her hands in his. Is this something you are glad about?" he asked, because it mattered to him to know, because she had always been clear that her own feelings were not negotiable. She looked at him, and her expression was open in the way it was in private, without the public composure that served her so well out in the world. "Yes," she said, "I am very glad. I did not entirely expect to be, but I am." He kissed her hands, which was perhaps more gesture than he would normally make, but the morning seemed to call for it. "Good," he said. "So am I." The pregnancy was, like Louisa herself, efficient and direct. She continued her practice until June, at which point the practical realities of the later months made the long drives to town less appealing, and she accepted the reduced schedule with better grace than he had expected, partly because She had spent a great deal of the previous months training a young man from the farming community who had expressed interest in animal medicine, and was able to delegate enough to him to keep the most essential cases covered. His name was Thomas Garland, 17 years old, earnest and attentive, and he followed Louisa around with the intense focus of someone who knows they are receiving an education that they would not get any other way. She was rigorous with him and patient in the same measure, and watching her teach was, Ralph found, as compelling as watching her work, the same quality of certainty but now directed toward transmitting what she knew, making it available beyond herself. "You are building something that will last past you," he told her one evening, watching her review Thomas's notes. She looked up. "That is the whole point," she said. "What I know should not die with me." "It won't," he said. Their son was born in late August, which made the timing feel like a deliberate echo of the summer of crisis that had brought his parents together, though of course it was coincidence. He was born at the ranch, attended by the doctor from Harlan's Crossing and by Maria Torres, who had experience with these things and whose presence was more calming than anyone else's. Ralph was present for the entirety of it because Louisa had asked him to be, and he had agreed without hesitation, and the experience was nothing like what he had expected, and more than anything he could have prepared for. They named the boy Elias Daniel Bishop, for both their fathers. He came into the world with a determination that was immediately recognizable as inherited, and he regarded the world with a fierce, wide-eyed attention that made everyone who met him laugh. The double cross in the months after Elias' birth had a different quality to its mornings. Ralph learned to work with a baby in a carrier on his back, which Clem Torres had constructed from a design his wife knew, and Louisa returned to her practice on a new schedule that worked around the baby's rhythms and hers. She nursed Elias in her office between appointments, and Thomas Garland, who had initially been uncertain how to behave around this new domestic reality, quickly adjusted to the point of becoming genuinely useful as an assistant in both capacities. Harlan's Crossing was still a small town, with all the limitations and occasional small-mindedness that implied. There were people who thought Louisa's continued practice was inappropriate for a married woman, particularly now a mother, and said so in the way people in small towns say things sidelong, in company, where it can be heard but not directly addressed. Louisa was aware of this and took a particular satisfaction in continuing to provide excellent care to people whose animals were sick regardless of their opinions about her marital and professional status. She had never been a woman who changed herself to match the room's expectations. Ralph dealt with the most explicit of these situations the one-time Jed Morton, who ran a hardware store and fancied himself the moral arbiter of the community, told Ralph directly that it was a shame his wife was still out doing a man's work rather than raising their child properly. Ralph looked at Jed Morton with the particular quality of calm he had that was more unsettling than anger and said, "I find, Jed, that I am not going to be taking advice on my household from a man who called in the wrong veterinarian for his prize cow last winter and lost her entirely. Miss Keene, as she was then, would have saved her. Good day." It was petty. He knew it was petty. He did not regret it at all. He told Louisa about it that evening, and she listened and then said, "You are a more vindictive man than you appear." "Only when it is warranted," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you. I told you," he said. "I am on your side." 2 years passed in the way that good years pass, not slowly and not quickly, but fully, with the texture and substance of a life that is genuinely being lived. The herd was rebuilt and then expanded, not rashly but carefully, and the Double Cross became known in that county as one of the better-run operations, partly because of Ralph's management, and partly because of the veterinary care that was simply superior to what any other ranch in the area could access. Thomas Garland, now 19, was becoming a genuinely capable practitioner under Louisa's mentorship. She had been corresponding with Dr. Forsyth in Billings about the possibility of Thomas spending a season there to expand his training, and Forsyth had agreed with enthusiasm. The arrangement was being organized for the following spring, and Louisa was already thinking about who might take Thomas's local role in the meantime. In the spring of 1885, Gerald Hatch's ranch had a serious outbreak of a different cattle disease, blackleg, swift and lethal, and requiring immediate expert intervention. Hatch's first instinct, clearly, had been to go elsewhere, but the available practitioners in the territory were either too far or too uncertain for the urgency of the situation. His foreman came to Louis's office on a Wednesday morning with a hat in his hand and an expression that sat somewhere between desperate and embarrassed. "Mr. Hatch would be grateful for Mrs. Bishop's help," the foreman said, with the specific tone of a man repeating words he had been instructed to use but was not comfortable using. "He understands there may have been tension in the past, and he hopes that won't be an obstacle." Louisa looked at the foreman. She was holding Elias on her hip, which gave the moment a quality that the foreman clearly had not expected. "Tell Mr. Hatch that I will be there this afternoon," she said, "and tell him that the fee will be my standard rate." "There is no premium for past behavior," the foreman blinked. "Yes, ma'am." She dealt with Hatch's outbreak with the same thoroughness and professionalism she brought to everything, and the cattle were saved, not all of them, but enough that Hatch's season was salvageable. Hatch himself came out of his house when she was loading up to leave on the second day and stood at a distance with his hat in his hands, which was a posture she had never seen on him before. "I am obliged," he said. "You paid my fee," she said. "You don't owe me anything more." He nodded, and that was it. Not a redemption story, not a transformation. Just a man who had been reduced to need and had found that the person he had tried to diminish was the one who came when called and would have to live with knowing that. Ralph, when she told him, said nothing for a moment. Then, "How did it feel?" "Like work," she said. "Like it always feels." A pause. "The animals didn't deserve to suffer for his stubbornness." He looked at her. "You are a better person than most." "I am a pragmatist," she said, but she was smiling. The summer of 1885 was a kind one. Not too hot, enough rain, the grass deep and green into August. The double cross ran 100 additional head above the prior year's count, and the numbers were good enough that Ralph allowed himself, for the first time, to think about what expansion might look like. Not recklessly, just thoughtfully. There was land to the north that was available, a homesteader's claim that had been abandoned when the family gave up and went back east, and it would double the accessible pasture if it could be acquired at a fair price. He talked it through with Louisa over several evenings, spreading the maps across the kitchen table, working through the numbers with her attention to precision that he had come to rely on as an essential part of his thinking. She was not a financial expert, but she was rigorous, and she asked the questions that cut to the point, and by the end of the third evening the path forward was clear. "Buy it," she said. "The numbers work, and you have been managing this operation conservatively for 5 years. It is time." He bought it. The acquisition was straightforward, a transaction with the county recorder's office, and the following spring he put the new pasture into use with a section of the expanded herd, and it worked exactly as well as the numbers said it would. Elias, who turned 3 in the summer of 1885, was a boy of enormous personality, loud, physical, curious about everything, particularly interested in the animals. He had already shown a fearlessness around horses that was both impressive and concerning, the kind of fearlessness that required continuous gentle redirection. He called Clem's horse by name and brought it grass from the edge of the pasture with the gravity of a man conducting important diplomatic business. Clem Torres watched this and told Ralph, with great seriousness, that the boy was going to be a horseman, and Ralph suspected he was right. Louisa watched her son with a quality in her face that Ralph had never seen anywhere else, something that had been added by motherhood, something that existed alongside the competence and the steadiness and the precision rather than replacing them. She was fully herself as a mother. She did not become softer or more uncertain. She just had more to love. In the autumn of 1885 she told him there would be another child. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, directly, clearly, across the breakfast table. This time he did not kneel. He crossed to her and pulled her to her feet and held her for a long moment without saying anything, and she let herself be held, which she had learned to do in the years since their marriage, not as capitulation but as something she chose because she wanted to. "Too," she said against his shoulder. "I hope for more than that," he said honestly. She laughed her real laugh, the unguarded one. "Let us see how this one goes first." This pregnancy was different from the first, more difficult in the earlier months, requiring more rest than Louisa was comfortable with, which led to a period of negotiation between what her body was telling her and what her schedule demanded. She cut her practice hours more dramatically than the first time, trusting Thomas Garland more fully, and Thomas proved equal to the trust in ways that reassured her. Ralph was careful with her in those months without making her feel like a patient, which was a distinction that required more attentiveness than it might seem. She was not fragile and she did not want to be treated as fragile, but she was also, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely subject to physical constraint in a way she could not simply will past, and finding the balance between accepting care and maintaining her sense of herself was its own kind of work. He understood this without being told, which was part of why she loved him. The second child came in the spring of 1886, a girl this time born as the snow was finally leaving the mountains and the first green was appearing on the hills. They named her Catherine Eleanor Bishop Catherine for no particular person, but because both of them liked it, Eleanor for Louisa's grandmother, a woman she had never met but whose name had been spoken with love. Catherine was from the first moments a different creature than her brother, quieter, watchful, inclined to observe before engaging, which was a quality that made her seem from very early on as though she understood more than she was letting on. She had Louisa's eyes. Ralph told Louisa this on the second day, and Louisa looked at the baby in her arms and then up at him and said, "Poor child," which made him laugh hard enough that Catherine opened her eyes and stared at him with an expression of ancient patience. Harlan's Crossing by 1886 was changing in the slow way that western towns changed. A new telegraph line had come through in 1884, and there was talk of a railroad spur that might come within 20 miles of town within the next few years. The population was growing, more homesteader families coming in, more commerce, more complexity. The town had hired a proper school teacher the previous year, and the school had expanded into a second room. There was a new doctor in Billings and occasional talk of the possibility of one coming to Harlan's Crossing itself. Louisa was thinking about the future of her practice in this changing landscape, thinking about it in the way she thought about everything, systematically, without sentimentality. Thomas Garland had returned from his time with Dr. Forsyth in Billings improved in exactly the way she had hoped, and she was increasingly giving him the primary role in day-to-day practice while she focused on the more complex cases, and on the documentation work that she had come to understand was one of the most important things she could do, recording the cases, the treatments, the outcomes, in detail sufficient to be useful to practitioners who would come after her. Her father's notes had saved Ralph's herd. She wanted her own notes to do the same for someone, somewhere, years from now, in a crisis she would never know about. She told Ralph about this one evening, and he listened to her think through it with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered, and then he said, "Have you considered writing it as a manual rather than just case notes, something organized for teaching?" She was quiet for a moment. "That is a significant undertaking." "You have done significant undertakings before," he said. "You saved my herd when I was too proud to ask you to." She looked at him. The phrase landed with a gentleness that was also an acknowledgement, not an accusation now, just the truth of how they had begun, the specific crack in his armor that had let everything in. "You let me," she said. "Barely," he said honestly, "but you did." She held his gaze. "That matters more than you think." He reached over and touched her face, a familiar gesture now, done 1,000 times and still carrying the same quality of intention it had carried the first time he tucked that strand of hair behind her ear. "Will you write it?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I think I will." She began it that winter, after the children were in bed, at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, her father's notebooks open beside her own, building something out of both of them, out of what Louisa Keene had known, and what Louisa Bishop had learned, and what the combination of those two bodies of knowledge amounted to after years of practice in the specific conditions of the Montana Territory. It was not a quick project. It would take her 3 more years to have something she considered ready, and another 2 after that to have it printed in Billings and distributed, in modest numbers, to practitioners throughout the territory. When the copies arrived, Ralph held one and read the title page, Practical Veterinary Medicine for the Frontier by Louisa E. Bishop, with acknowledgement of the foundational work of Dr. Louisa Keene. He turned it over in his hands with the same attention he gave to things that mattered. "My father would have liked this," he said. She looked at him. "My father would have been insufferable about it," she said. "He would have pointed out everything I got wrong." "Would he have gotten it wrong?" "Some of it." She took the book from him and held it. "Some of it I know better than he did because I was here when he wasn't." A pause. "That's a strange thing to say." "It is true, though," Ralph said. She nodded slowly. "It is true." Elias, at 6, had begun to follow Ralph around the ranch with the serious attention of a boy who is learning how a thing works. He was in the barn before breakfast, and at the fence watching the herd in the evenings, and Ralph, who had always worked in a kind of private internal conversation with himself, discovered that explaining what he was doing to a 6-year-old required him to understand it more completely, which was a gift he had not expected from parenthood. Catherine, at 2, was a study in quiet intensity who had already worked out that if she waited until everyone else was distracted, she could get into whatever she wanted, which was everything. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and some third quality that seemed to be entirely her own, a patience, a stillness, a quality of observation that made both her parents feel, at odd moments, as though they were being carefully studied by someone who had very specific opinions about them. The winter of 1887 was hard. It was the beginning of what would become known across the territory as the worst winters in recent memory, a pattern of ice and cold that killed livestock across Montana in numbers that the ranching community had not seen in a generation. The Double Cross was not immune. They lost animals, not to disease this time, but to cold and the difficulty of feeding a large herd through ice storms that made hay access dangerous and challenging. Ralph and Clem and Dix and a neighbor boy they hired for the season worked through the worst of it, and Louisa worked alongside them, which she had always done when the ranch needed it, because the Double Cross was hers as much as it was his, and she had never treated it otherwise. There were nights during that winter when they were both so tired that conversation was beyond them, and they sat by the fire with the children already in bed and the wind pushing at the windows, and the silence between them was the particular silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to name it. One such night, Ralph looked at her across the fire and said, "I would not have made it through this winter alone." She looked up from the sock she was mending. "Probably not." "I do not mean the work," he said. "Although the work too," a pause. "I mean I would not have wanted to." She put down the sock. She looked at him with the fullness of attention she gave to things that mattered, that clear, measuring look that had unsettled him the first time he saw it and now felt like home. "Neither would I," she said. The spring of 1888 was the kind of spring that comes after a brutal winter, extravagant, almost aggressive in its greenness, the land restoring itself with more energy than seemed physically possible. The surviving herd came through leaner but healthy, and the pastures were lush in ways they had not been for years, and the ranch absorbed its losses and kept going, which was what ranches did when they were well run. Thomas Garland, now 22, had by this point taken on primary operational responsibility for Louisa's practice, with her as mentor and senior consultant. He was good. He was not as good as she was, he knew this. She knew this. And neither of them pretended otherwise, but he was good enough. And more importantly, he was growing, and he treated the manual she had written as the essential reference it was intended to be. He had also taken on an apprentice of his own, a young woman named Addie Marsh, whose family farmed the South Valley, which Louisa considered the most satisfying professional development of her career to date. "It continues," she told Ralph. "Because you started it," he said. "Because my father started it," she said. "I continued it, and now Thomas and Addie will continue it. That is how things survive." He thought about that for a moment. "Is that why you chose to stay after your father died? Because you were the continuation?" She considered this seriously, as she considered everything seriously. "Partly, also because I was needed. Also because," she paused, "also because this is where I am myself. I did not know that about myself when I stayed, not consciously. But looking back, I think I knew somewhere that if I left, I would be looking for this my whole life and not finding it." "This," he said. "This," she agreed. And the word enclosed all of it: the ranch, the land, the practice, the work, the children asleep upstairs, the fire, the man across from her who had held a sick bull steady at 3 in the morning, and apologized to her at a fence, and written a letter to the agricultural board, and built her a treatment room without being asked, and told her she was exceptional because it was true. In the summer of 1889, they had a third child. A boy, Oliver James Bishop, who came into the world in July with a set of lungs that immediately established his personality as distinct from either of his siblings. He was loud and cheerful and physically fearless in a way that kept everyone near him in a constant low-grade state of alert. Elias, at 7, regarded his younger brother with a kind of beleaguered older sibling patience that made him look far more adult than his age. Catherine, at 3, simply incorporated Oliver into her worldview without apparent disruption, the way she incorporated everything, studying him, filing the data, moving on. The double cross was, by this point, genuinely thriving. The expanded pasture had been fully integrated. The herd was at its highest count yet. Ralph had taken on a third hand, a quiet man named Arnie Cole, who had come west from Ohio, and who had an instinct for cattle that made him immediately valuable. The operation had reached a size and a stability that Ralph had spent 10 years working toward, and standing in the east pasture on a clear September morning with the mountains catching the early light, and the herd spread across the grass, and the sound of his children playing somewhere behind the barn, he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has built what he set out to build, and has found it is better than he imagined. Louisa came out from the house with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him. She handed him his cup and looked out at the same view, and for a while neither of them said anything. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I would have let this all die," he said, "if you had driven away that night." She was quiet for a moment. "I was not going to drive away. I know that now. I knew it then," she said. "I had seen too much of what happens when someone with the knowledge doesn't push past the person who won't ask. I was not going to watch your herd die because your pride was louder than your sense." A pause with a dry warmth in it, even if it was formidable pride. "It was," he agreed without defensiveness. "I have worked on it." "You have," she said. "Considerably." He looked at her profile in the morning light, the same face he had watched across a fence at 3 in the morning, across a restaurant table, across a kitchen table 1,000 times, the face of his wife, the person he had built this life with, the person whose competence had saved what he loved and whose presence had made the saving worth having. "Louisa," he said. "Yes. Thank you for not driving away." She turned to look at him, and her expression was the fully unguarded one, the one that was only ever in private, the one that was entirely hers. "Thank you for opening the gate," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of long habit and genuine choice. And the mountains were gold in the morning light, and the cattle moved through the grass with the slow contentment of healthy animals in good pasture, and somewhere behind the barn, Elias was saying something to his brother and sister in the firm tone of a 7-year-old who has decided to be in charge, and Catherine was undoubtedly ignoring him with serene efficiency. And Oliver was probably attempting to climb something he had been told not to climb. They stood there together in the morning, on the land they had both chosen and the life they had built from a crisis, an offense and 3 words said at 3 in the morning, and the future was wide and clear before them, not without hardship, because the land did not promise that, and the territory did not promise that, and life did not promise that, but together, which was the only version either of them wanted. In the years that followed, the double cross continued to grow and season. Elias grew into a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and by 15, he was Ralph's most trusted hand on the property, which was not favoritism but simple observation. Catherine, quiet and brilliant, developed an interest in her mother's work that Louisa recognized immediately and nurtured without pressure, answering questions, sharing the manual, letting the girl sit in on cases when she was old enough to be helpful. Oliver remained magnificent chaos that the whole family organized itself around with practiced affection. Thomas Garland's practice, grown from Louisa's mentorship, became one of the most respected in the region. Addie Marsh, his apprentice, went on to become a fully independent practitioner who eventually moved to a town 50 miles north and served that community for decades. Louisa's manual was reprinted twice and found its way to practitioners in territories she had never visited, doing the work she had intended it to do. Gerald Hatch retired from ranching in 1892 and sold his operation to his son, who was a more reasonable man. Clem Torres and his wife Maria remained at the Double Cross until Clem's retirement in 1895, at which point his eldest son took up the work, which was a continuity that Ralph and Louisa both found deeply satisfying. Dix Albright went north to the Dakotas in 1888, following a woman he had been writing to for 2 years, a story that Ralph thought he recognized the shape of, even if the specifics were different from his own. The cracked bell in the church was finally replaced in 1890 by a new one that rang clear and clean across the valley, and though neither Ralph nor Louisa was particularly religious, the sound of it on Sunday mornings became part of the texture of their life, part of the sound of Harlan's Crossing, evolving from a rough frontier settlement into something more established, more permanent. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in December of 1892, Ralph and Louisa sat at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to bed, with a bottle of good wine that Ralph had purchased specifically for the occasion from the Saloon Hotel's small supply. The house was warm and the night outside was full of snow, the quiet particular to a Montana night with heavy snowfall, and the lamp was turned low and the fire was burning steadily. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. Are you surprised by any of it, he asked. She thought about this with genuine consideration. I am surprised by how much I love it, she said finally. I expected to love you. I expected to love the children. I was not sure I would love the daily shape of the life. The repetition, the ordinariness of it. And you do. I do, she said. The ordinariness of it is where the real things happen. She turned her wine glass in her hands. I think I expected to always be fighting. The way I had always been fighting for the right to work, for the right to be taken seriously, for the right to stay. And I still do some of that. I will always do some of that. She looked up at him. But here, with you, I have not had to fight to be myself. That is, I did not know that was possible. I thought it was a thing that happened in books and not in real life. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you have made me better, he said. Not by changing me, by being the kind of person who made it impossible for me to stay as limited as I was. She looked at him steadily. You were not so limited. I was too proud to ask for help, he said simply. That is a significant limitation. Was, she said. Was, he agreed. Because of you. She reached across the table and took his hand. They sat like that in the warmth of the house they had made and the life they had built, the snow falling outside and the mountains invisible but present, always present, and the children asleep upstairs with all their tomorrows ahead of them, and the years already lived settled around them like something solid and real that no one and nothing could take. "To 10 more," Louisa said, lifting her glass. "To all of them," Ralph said, lifting his. They drank. The fire settled. The snow came down. And in the morning the land would be white and the mountains would catch the sun, and the herd would move through the new day with the particular grace of healthy animals on good ground. And there would be work to do. There was always work to do, and they would do it together, the way they had done everything that mattered. The double cross endured. The Bishop family endured. The knowledge Louisa carried endured in the manuals and the mentorship, and the careful, painstaking documentation of what she had learned from her father and from the land, and from the animals and from herself. And in the quiet of an ordinary morning, when the coffee was hot and the children were loud and the mountains were clear, and the man across the table was watching her with the same quality of attention he had always given to things that were real, Louisa Elias Bishop knew, with the certainty she brought to everything, that this was a life that was entirely, fully, and completely hers. Not despite everything she had fought for, because of it. And that made all the difference.